Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard. Today I've got another utterly pointless comparison for you. I love Street Fighter 2, you sure seem to love Street Fighter 2, so today I'll be looking at the arcade and 3DO versions of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Ordinarily, in this part of the video, I'd splash the specs from each hardware up on the screen so we could compare them and see how they differ, but because the 3DO works so fundamentally differently from the CPS2 hardware, it doesn't really make sense to do that here. So I'm going to skip that part, but I will still tell you about the game just a little bit. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo hit the arcades in February of 1994 and was the last revision of Street Fighter 2. It added a lot of things to the game, including new moves for the characters, it rebalanced the characters, it added the Super Meter and Super Combo system, and oh yeah, it also added an insane, inhumanly difficult one-player mode that makes the game a lot less fun because it's now hard as f***. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo landed on the 3DO in November of 1994 and made its way stateside shortly thereafter. It was the only console version of Super Turbo in the US for quite some time after its release. I always found it a little odd that Capcom chose to put this game on the 3DO, since it had a very small user base compared to the 16-bit consoles that were still alive and kicking back then, even if they were a bit long in the tooth at that point. Now, with Super Turbo being ported to a 32-bit console like the 3DO, you might have expected a perfect arcade conversion. Which brings me to my next point. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo on the 3DO is not perfect, which does however make it perfect for this comparison video. Now, I'm going to be honest here, I'm going to have these games up side by side, and I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. A lot of people seem to remember the 3DO as being a lot closer to the arcade version than it actually is. Now, while it's true in some ways it's superior to the 16-bit systems, there are other ways it actually lags behind them, and you'll see what I mean. Alright, recording methodology for this one. I did use save states, and I used them at the start of each fight, except for when fighting Akuma, where I use it at the start of each round. Why? Because Akuma is a cheap who can stick his Aside from that, the only other thing I did was very slightly edit down some of the admittedly already short load times in the 3DO version to keep the two games in sync. Alright, that about covers it. On with the show! It begins! First up, the 3DO is missing all the parallax scrolling. The 3DO version of Super Turbo has larger characters than the 16-bit era ports, and the character animation is a lot closer to the arcade game as well. Now, the 3DO is capable of displaying 16.7 million colors, so it's a little strange to see how much color has been removed from the 3DO port. If you look at the sky in the background and the spectators, you can see the extent to how badly the color was cut. The backgrounds are also considerably less detailed and look lower res on 3DO. You'll find a significant loss in detail among spectators and various background elements. Some spectators that animate in the arcade original are still pictures on 3DO. The music from the 3DO version comes primarily from the prior release of Super Street Fighter 2 on the FM Towns. It's a Red Book audio version of the soundtrack, and it's definitely good, but I feel like some of the songs are better in the original arcade release. A quick note here, Turbo Speed 1 in the arcade is a lot faster than Turbo Speed 1 on 3DO. I played the 3DO version primarily at Turbo Speed 2, as it's roughly equivalent to Speed 1 in the arcade. It's a little bit faster, but it's close. Here's Chun-Li's stage. Again, you can notice the downgrade in detail among the spectators. The window in the building to the right is missing a bunch of detail. Almost all of the blinds are gone. The floor is much more pixelated. If you look at the ground just below the guy with the hat in the alley, it's kind of a mess on 3DO detail-wise. Once again, the colors have been pretty clearly cut down, which is particularly obvious when you look at the clouds in the sky and also the alleyway itself. Now, if we look at the characters themselves, they also appear blockier and lower res on 3DO. And there seems to be some artifacting on a few of the animation frames. Let's talk about game speed a little bit more. For the arcade game here, I played through the entire game on Turbo Speed 1, which is the lowest speed setting. For the 3DO, I have a mix of primarily Turbo Speed 2 footage with a little bit of Turbo Speed 1. As I mentioned before, Speed 1 on the 3DO is considerably slower than Speed 1 in the arcade game, but I think that's a good thing. It's got a little more variety, and in Speed 1 on the arcade is a little fast. For music in this stage, I prefer the arcade original to the 3DO track. All the music is good on 3DO, but there are some songs that still sound better in the arcade version, to me at least, and this is one of them. Chun-Li's defeat portrait is slightly different on 3DO as she rests her face on her hand. Brazil. And here's Blanca's stage. I'll sound like a broken record, but the 3DO version suffers the same issues on almost every stage, including this one. Fewer colors, no parallax, lower effective resolution, and considerably less detail. Look at the top of the hut in both versions. It's much more detailed in the arcade original, and none of the spectators in the hut animate at all on 3DO, while some of them do in the arcade version. We'll also see here that the floor looks much chunkier, or more pixely if you prefer, on 3DO. It also looks like it has some kind of weird pixel shift or aliasing problem. They also added a weird little section of beach or something above the wooden dock on 3DO. Why? So they wouldn't have spectators on top of the line-scrolling floor there. Take a look, no spectators' feet are on the floor of the dock in the 3DO version. Also, the water doesn't sparkle on 3DO like it does in the arcade. Anyway, music. Blanca's music is probably my least favorite musical piece in the 3DO release. It just sounds off. I'll also note here that the 3DO version has the critical versions of the songs, and it was the first major Western release of the game to feature those. Unless you use Capcom's special controller for this game on 3DO, you don't really get a great control experience. There are 5 buttons on standard 3DO controllers. They're sort of like an original Genesis pad with 3 face buttons, and then 2 added shoulder buttons. Instead of a start button, we have a stop and a pause button, so you have to use the gummy little pause button as one of your 6 action buttons in this game, and it's not particularly great at that. Alright, hey, it's T-Hawk, how about that? I can't stand this character with his obscenely long grapple reach. Anyway, let's talk about the differences. Like the other stages, color and detail differences are very apparent. In this stage, perhaps more apparent than many of the others. The apples, or whatever produce is in the background under the tent to the upper left, is just a mess of pixels on 3DO, while it's detailed and easy to see the individual items in the arcade original. The difference in resolution is also pretty obvious if you look at the spectators, or even some simple background elements like the hats and baskets off to the left. If you look at the building in the background, especially the left side of it, just above the tent, it's much darker in the arcade release and has way more shades of color. And the windows are also more defined. Likewise, the stonework of the building itself is much more defined in the arcade game, and kind of a pixely mess on 3DO. But hey, at least the birds don't look like slugs on 3DO, which they kinda do in the Genesis version of regular Super. As far as the music goes here, it's pretty good in both versions. I can't really say that one is superior to the other. I like the unique sound of each.
India.
Alright, time to get serious for Dulcin's stage. This stage in particular fares worse on 3DO than any other. While it's got the 3 rows of elephants that the arcade version has, because there's no parallax, it looks like they're floating above the ground rather than standing on it. It's pretty distracting, and it looks very similar to how this stage was done on the PC Engine version of Champion Edition. Also on 3DO, the elephants never animate. so we won't see them raising their trunks or anything. The floor in this stage is, once again, very chunky looking. I mean, just check out the carpet in each version. They're pretty different. It's much more defined in the arcade version. And if we look at the stones on the floor or the gates in the background, we once again get that low-res vibe on 3DO. Musically, again, I'll call this a draw. It's not the best song in either game, and neither one sounds any better than the other in my opinion. Here we are on the stage with the song that goes with everything. Speaking of the song, hey, chalk up a win for the 3DO here. I like both versions, but I think the 3DO version of this song sounds better. Another positive is that this stage comes off pretty well on 3DO. The lack of parallax doesn't hurt too much here either, even though it's still very apparent. You could even make the argument that there's some simulated parallax with the way that the crates move. Anyway, we've still got chunkier pixels on everything, but it's not too bad. On the downside, we do lose the nice multi-layer scrolling effect on the clouds up at the top of the screen. The plane in the background is considerably darker on 3DO for some reason. And if you really want to see a difference in detail between these versions, check out the warning sign all the way to the left on the fence. In the arcade, it's dramatically more legible than it is on 3DO. You can't even really tell it says warning on 3DO. It looks almost like the pixelization game on an episode of Actually. I'd wondered if Capcom maybe reused the graphics from the FM Towns version of Super Street Fighter 2, but after taking a long look at that game, it doesn't appear that they have. The colors and character detail are quite a bit different in that version, although, strangely enough, the simplest looking spectators look pretty similar between that version and the 3DO version. At the end here, we'll see that Guile's defeat portrait is different in both versions. Back to the old USSR, which, collapsed about 10 months after the release of the original Street Fighter 2, and hadn't existed anymore for quite some time by the point that Super Turbo came out. Something fun I waited to point out until now: the numbers on the timer at the top of the screen are so wide on 3DO that they sometimes touch, which looks more than a bit sloppy. An extra pixel between them would have been nice. Alright, as for the background in this stage, yeah, all the usual color and detail cuts have been applied. The loss of parallax isn't too bad here, which is helped out a bit by the foreground chain simulating a scrolling layer. It would have looked nicer with the back wall having its own scrolling layer like in the arcade, but this one's mostly okay. I have to wonder, couldn't they have simulated another background layer just by using some large software sprites or something on 3DO? Surely it would have had enough power to do that. I don't know, if you have any reason why I couldn't, feel free to let me know in the comments. Musically, I'll give the win to the 3DO for this track as well. It's decent in the arcade, but this one definitely sounds better on 3DO. Here we are in jolly old England. And this stage, well, it's another kind of rough one for the 3DO. I mean, come on. Couldn't they have made the bridge its own scrolling layer? The characters and shadows, they even move really weirdly across it. It's hard to describe, but if you look at it, I'm sure you'll notice. This stage on 3DO almost looks more like the SNES or Genesis version in some ways. The color and detail on the ground behind the bridge has been really dialed back. The aurora in the sky is very choppy compared to the arcade original. Again, it looks similar to something from the SNES version, but it does look better than the aurora on the Genesis release. The crows or ravens or whatever are kinda hilariously fat on the 3DO version. Must be good eating up on that castle and bridge. For the music, I'm calling it a draw again. This song sounds good on both platforms, and I can't really pick a winner between the two. And once again, the defeat portrait is slightly different on the 3DO, adding Cammy's hand. I'm going to use the US names for the bosses, so if they're different in your territory, sorry, but I'm sure you can figure out who's who by now. Anyway, I always thought the arcade version made some strange color choices in this stage, with that super light gray or bluish gray in the background. They darkened it a bit on 3DO and it looks a lot nicer, so that's a plus. The dithering is a little rougher on 3DO, however. Also, the spectators take quite a graphical hit in this stage in particular, losing lots of detail and lots of animation. Disappointingly, the background on 3DO is missing just about all of the flashing lights from the arcade version. The sign below Nin Nin Hall no longer has a flashing border on 3DO, and the lights lining the sides of the stage no longer pulse on and off on 3DO. Likewise, the 3DO version is missing the flashing cycling lights on the floor. And on the 3DO, the spectator all the way to the left, yeah, the one in the foreground that doesn't animate, he makes me think that maybe Hitler has been hiding out in Vegas all these years. Musically, I'd probably go with the arcade game for this song. It's okay on 3DO, but the choice of instruments isn't entirely fitting. Spain. Oh, 3DO. How dare you not start the match with the cage falling down? And yeah, no parallax. At least unlike most earlier console ports, we get the guitarists, 2 dancing girls, and the matador on the stage. The flashing lights below the stage from the arcade game are missing on 3DO. I will also take this opportunity to say, f*** CPU-controlled Vega, he's almost as bad as Akuma in this game. I don't know why Capcom decided to ratchet up the difficulty of Super Turbo so much, because it really reduces the fun factor of the game. Some of the spectators' faces on the 3DO on this stage are downright hilarious. I mean, just look at the face of the guy just to the left of the stage on 3DO. What happened there? And the guy all the way to the left side of the table, he looks like he has no face on 3DO, only a skull. Musically, it's a bit of a tough call again. If you were to twist my arm, I'd say, hey, stop doing that! And then I'd probably give the nod to the 3DO Vega theme. And Vega's defeat portrait is much bloodier in the arcade than on 3DO. Here we are in Thailand, which I've seriously heard people pronounce Thailand, because they apparently were not very smart. For Sagat's stage, the giant statue looks pretty decent, but the detail, resolution, and color are definitely scaled back a bit on the 3DO. The lack of parallax on this stage hurts it a bit, as you don't really get to see the buildings near the sunset in the background on 3DO. Speaking of the sunset, it's got way less color on 3DO. The 3DO release is also missing some clouds. It's almost like the devs got tired of working on the game by this point, or like, f*** those clouds. Musically, I will once again call the old draw. They're pretty much even in my opinion. And that's about all I have to say for this stage. The defeat portrait for Sagat once again adds a hand on 3DO, and also has less blood or drool or whatever coming out of his mouth. And here's M. Bison's stage, and wait a minute, oh shit, it's Akuma. I can't stress this enough. F Akuma. F him in his stupid. He's one of the cheapest end bosses in fighting game history. Back to the game. Bison stage. At first glance, it looks like they did a pretty good job here. On second glance, it looks like they cut a whole lot of corners here. In the arcade original, both the floor and ceiling line scroll. On 3DO, the floor line scrolls, but the ceiling doesn't. And the floor, well, in the arcade game, it's 4 tiles deep and line scrolls all the way back. On 3DO, you get about 1.2 tiles deep, and then after that it's just a mishmash of color. And we only see line scrolling where the tiles are. This is because they couldn't put the line scrolling floor under the spectators, otherwise they'd look like they were floating just like the elephants in Dulcim's stage. Oh, and they didn't even bother putting a shadow under the bell on 3DO. The spectators in this stage run the gamut of slightly less detailed to way less detailed than the arcade version on 3DO. Even the columns we see on the left and the right are a lot chunkier and flatter on 3DO. The wall way off to the right side is a lot darker and less detailed on 3DO, and on 3DO they also added that same wall to the left side, just like they did on the 16-bit console releases. Akuma's super intense music is super intense on both platforms. And here's the familiar ending. The music is nicer on 3DO for this. Other than that, it's pretty much the same on both platforms. Look at all the pretty pictures. Like the rest of the game, they have fewer colors and are a bit chunkier looking on 3DO, which is especially noticeable on outlines. Strangely enough, in the arcade version we get actual credits, while in the 3DO we just get the names of the fighters. What an odd choice. Finally, we have this lovely group picture with Ryu staring at Chun-Li's boobs while T-Hawk holds his hand up to give Cammy some modesty. Poor Fei Long seems to have lost an eye. And a bonus point if you caught that Dulcim is floating slightly higher on the 3DO versus the arcade. Alright, thanks for sticking around to the end. So Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo on the 3DO is kind of a maddening experience. I mean, I still remember I had seen screenshots of the game before it came out, but they didn't talk about it a whole lot to say what it was like. So the first time I saw this, it was at an Incredible Universe, right around the time the game was new and that store still existed. And upon first sight, I was kind of shocked that there was no parallax scrolling in the game, and it sort of turned me off immediately. I mean, I played it and I liked it back then, but I'm like, is this really next generation? Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of positives here. The character sprites look much better on 3DO than they do in the Genesis or Super Nintendo versions. They have a lot more animation, and they're larger, and they're more colorful, even though they're less colorful in the arcade. We also get much clearer voices than either the Super Nintendo or Genesis versions, even though the voices are still not as clear as the arcade original. We also get the CD quality music tracks along with the critical versions of the songs. So yeah, that's all good. But still, some of the things that had to be cut from this version of the game are really kind of shocking, especially on a system that's supposed to be as powerful as the 3DO was. I mean, the lack of parallax scrolling and some of the workarounds they used are just very, very jarring in this. And like I mentioned before, I have to wonder why they couldn't have simulated it using some other hardware technical trick. I mean, if there's any 3DO tech head out there, I would be really interested to know why you think they didn't try to use any other method to work around the lack of parallax. So going back to it, the reason this game is so maddening is that while there are parts of it that are clearly superior to the 16-bit console ports that came before it, there are also parts of it that are clearly inferior to those same console ports, which is kind of ridiculous on a 32-bit system that came out years after the Genesis and Super Nintendo. As things stand, we ended up with an okay-looking and pretty good playing version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo that really just should have been better. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe for more retro gaming goodness. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on 3DO Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo or any of the other versions in the comments. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.